Thank you all so much for the opportunity to give this presentation today. I'd like to thank the organizers of the workshop for their gracious invitation, as well as their resilience and agility in quickly creating an inclusive and engaging virtual workshop in the wake of the pandemic. My name is Lejo Flores, and I'm faculty at Boise State University in the Department of Geosciences. This presentation includes important contributions from Dr. Caroline Nash, Katie Murenbield, and Ahmad Rezai, who I have the pleasure of working with. The overarching goal of my presentation today is to provide an overview of some of what I consider fascinating and complex challenges that we face in understanding the connection between Earth's critical zone and the climate. But before I start, I'd like to first acknowledge that Boise State University sits in the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock and Northern Paiute tribes. I recognize the continuing and systemic injustices that stem directly from past wrongdoings, and I affirm my responsibility to stand with the indigenous people who want support in protecting their land and culture from further devastation. Today we'll start with where so many critical zone talks start, and that is with Hans Jenny's conceptual model of soil formation. It posits that soil formation is a function of climate, organisms or biota, relief or topography, parent material, and time. The discipline we now know as critical zone science seeks to advance mechanistic understanding of this conceptual model. And we now know that this relationship is highly nonlinear, the terms interact with one another, and that Jenny's model importantly doesn't include a term related to human disturbance of the critical zone. NSF's Critical Zone Observatory program has been critical in improving understanding of how climate influences the critical zone. But even as this figure, which appeared in the National Academy's report in 2001, that was the impetus for the CZO program, illustrates, we have long understood that the converse is also true, that the critical zone influences climate. The critical zone controls the movement of water in the near-surface environment, impacts land-atmosphere exchanges of water, energy, carbon, and other constituents, and controls the export of carbon and other weathering products from the land to the ocean. The case that I want to make to you today is that there is a lot of opportunity in understanding how the critical zone influences climate. A key facet of understanding how the CZ influences climate lies in understanding modern Earth system models, or ESMs. ESMs, the one shown here corresponding to the Community Earth System Model that's developed and maintained by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, are numerical models that represent key components that control Earth's climate. In some sense, an Earth system model is a model of models. CESM, for example, is comprised of sophisticated models of the atmosphere, sea ice, oceans, land ice, river runoff, and land processes, with a flux coupler in charge of passing fluxes, evapotranspiration for instance, from one realm to another, or from land to atmosphere in that example. Earth system models have been a grand prize for many for a long time, and even in their early conceptualization you can see a recognition of the importance of soil formation. This so-called wiring diagram from Bretherton almost 35 years ago puts soil development at the center of the Earth system, while showing how various components of the Earth system connect. I think an appropriate shorthand for soil formation is really DCZDT, and putting it that way, what we're really after is an understanding of how the dynamics of the critical zone fit within the broader Earth system. It is interesting to track the evolution of the land component of Earth system models through time to see how they complexify throughout time. This is a really great figure from a paper by Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven this year that shows when various processes were introduced into global land models. As you can see, land surface models began as simple representations of Earth's surface, whose primary job was to pass latent and sensible heat fluxes to the atmosphere. They are now complex representations of the land that include carbon and nitrogen cycling, representations of crops, and even limited representations of lateral flow in the subsurface. This is another figure from Fisher and Coven's work that shows another wiring diagram for a potential global land model that encompasses a variety of existing and future process representation. It's important here to underscore that we're talking about global models within Earth system models. So sometimes for us CZ scientists, the addition of new processes and improvements in spatial resolutions in global simulations coupled to the atmosphere, for example, are often 1 to 1/2 of a degree at best, can be frustratingly slow. But complexification of global land models is a delicate balance between fidelity to the underlying processes themselves and the computational burden required to simulate those processes. Let's focus a bit more on the community land model, the global land model within CESM. Here's a conceptual illustration of how CESM represents surface energy balance, hydrologic fluxes, and biogeochemical cycles in coupling between the CZ and the atmosphere. Going back to that Bretherton example, we want to ask ourselves, is the rate of change of specific CZ properties as forced by climate, the dCZ/dt term, sufficiently fast that it could actually change surface water, energy, and carbon balance at climate-relevant timescales? And if so, how do we build dynamic representations of those CZ properties that are coupled to whatever climate variables are driving them? This leads to some work that my group is doing in support of a larger project with teammates Pam Sullivan, the lead PI, Sharon Billings, Dan Hirmas, and Lee Lee to examine this very question. Hirmas et al. 2018 did a thorough examination of a number of soil samples analyzed by the NRCS going back to the 1960s. They found that soil macroporosity changes over much faster timescales than previously recognized, with drier climates associated with greater macroporosity than more humid climates. This shows the continental scale patterns in effective porosity in the near surface and in the deeper subsurface. When they further accounted for non-climatic factors that control effective porosity, computing what they call the residual effective porosity, they found a very strong association with climate, particularly in the deeper subsurface. The drier interior of Conus was associated with higher residual effective porosity than most of the eastern U.S. or the West Coast. They also analyzed a subset of their data to find that, in fact, residual effective porosity was changing at timescales much faster than pedogenesis. Some calculations they did suggest that saturated hydraulic conductivity in some locations could change by as much as 55% by the end of the century due to precipitation intensification. An important finding from Dan and his co-authors was that they found Important about this work, Dan and his co-authors found consistent relationships between precipitation and that residual effective porosity, with more precipitation being associated with lower macroporosity and less precipitation being associated with higher macroporosity. When those authors then took into consideration relationships between climate, macroporosity, and saturated hydraulic conductivity, and they projected values of KSAT into the future to the end of the century based on projected changes in precipitation, what they found was that KSAT could decrease by up to 55% in those locations where precipitation intensification or increase was highest. Conversely, KSAT could increase by up to 33% in locations where precipitation decreases are the largest. So in the following slides, what I'm going to try and do is lead you through a couple of different conceptual models that our team has developed and proposed for how climate change and precipitation change in particular could influence soil properties, macroporosity, and KSAT, chief among them. At present, our team has developed at least a few plausible hypotheses that could give rise to this empirical finding from Hirmas et al. First, more precipitation at the mean annual timescale, all other things being equal, would tend to increase soil moisture, reduce the magnitude of shrink-swell cycles, and reduce aggregate stability, leading to lower macroporosity. Alternatively, more soil moisture could promote biomass growth in water-limited systems, leading to more root mass that would tend to clog pores, which again would reduce macroporosity. So one very important and quite frankly fascinating thing about both of those conceptual models that we just went through is that in both cases the proposed mechanism is actually biotic in nature. And what's interesting about that is that biotic processes change over timescales that are much faster than many of the other abiotic processes that are responsible for soil formation. So this is what makes us think that actually soil properties might be changing at much faster timescales than most of us sort of originally thought, and it might in fact be due to the relationship between climate and the critical zone biota. So while a lot of smart folks on our team are actively trying to discern the mechanisms through which macroporosity changes over these shorter timescales, what we the modelers want to ask is, if in fact KSAT is changing at much faster timescales, what are the ramifications for continental scale hydrologic budgets? And ultimately, do these changes in hydrologic budgets at the land surface feed back to climate at timescales that would suggest that soil actually needs to be treated as a dynamic property in global land models? So Katie Murrenbield in our group is currently setting up and about to conduct a suite of numerical experiments that are designed to assess the degree to which changes in soil hydraulic conductivity of the magnitude suggested by the work of Dan Irmas et al. Matter at the scale of the continent. Here's a cartoon hill slope that illustrates our conceptual framework and allows us to put forward some testable hypotheses. The first step in our experimental design is to do a control run with a period of constant climate and background values of KSAT already in the model in order to establish baseline seasonal cycles of runoff, evaporative fraction, recharge, and other hydrologic properties. Then the next step in our experimental setup is to reduce the saturated hydraulic conductivity based on the mean annual precipitation changes in ways that are consistent with the suggestions of Irmas et al. We will then use that same period of climate forcing to rerun CLM, and again we'll compute rainfall runoff partitioning, evaporation, and recharge seasonal cycles as well as a host of other hydrologic variables. To first order, we might expect that the reduction in KSAP might lead to a shift in the timing of runoff cycles as soils saturate more quickly. However, changes in spatiotemporal distributions of latent heat flux are likely more complex and also influenced, importantly, by the vegetation response. The next step, as you might expect, is to then examine the impact of an increase in hydraulic conductivity that's consistent with those suggested by Irmas et al. Again, using that same period of climate forcing to rerun CLM, we'll examine the impact of changing soil properties on surface water and energy fluxes. We might correspondingly expect that runoff regimes, for example, might be attenuated and shifted with that increase in KSAT. These preliminary experiments using CLM are relatively simple numerical experiments that serve to examine the effects of potential changes in soil properties on surface water and energy fluxes. But our larger team envisions that these experiments are only the beginning of a larger effort to reimagine the parameterizations of soils in these global land models, potentially leading to future representations of soils that respond to climate change and are modulated by biotic and abiotic factors. As someone who thinks about things like hill slopes quite a bit, I'd also like to point out the ongoing work in the community aimed at improving the representation of topography in land models. This is a diagram that I developed a long time ago that really illustrates a dilemma in my head between the need for efficient representations of soil, vegetation, and topography in global land models on one hand, and the fact that these features covary in the landscape on the other. And while the CZ network has done a lot of work to illustrate that covariation is driven by climate, there is now an opportunity to ask what the impacts of covariation in soils, topography, and vegetation have on climate. One paper that just came out last year that I had the privilege to contribute to was the result of a number of workshops by many in the CZ community and global land modelers. Those workshops, led by Ying Fan at Rutgers University, did a nice job of eliciting some of the testable hypotheses about the relationship between hill slope scale topography and climate. This set of figures illustrates an oft-observed effect of topography in the redistribution of moisture from ridge tops to valley bottoms. The diagram on the right presents 9 hypotheses about how lateral redistribution of moisture at hill slope scales impacts the landscape scale of evapotranspiration as a function of climate and topographic relief. Another observation, and one that is near and dear to my heart, is the relationship between hill slope aspect, the cardinal direction that a hill slope faces, and emergent properties like vegetation cover and slope steepness. In the northern hemisphere, particularly in places here like Idaho, we tend to associate north-facing slopes as having more vegetation, deeper soils, and higher average soil moisture. The figure on the right, again an outcome of the workshops led by Ying, posits the impacts of hill slope asymmetry on where a landscape sits on the Boudico curve, that is, whether or not it is energy or water limited, as a function of both latitude and topographic relief. Interestingly, this conceptual model predicts that landscapes, perhaps ones that you and I know well, where asymmetry is highest, may be associated with seasonal shifts in being water or energy limited. In support of this workshop, the developers of CLM have implemented some new ways to represent hill slope scale topography in CLM. Effectively, this new representation, which is now available in CLM version 5, allows users to create multiple hill slopes within a single land modeling pixel, connecting them in ways that make sense in a geomorphic or hydrologic context. Those connected hill slope elements can be oriented with different aspects in order to represent the impacts of hill slope asymmetry on landscape level responses. And although preliminary testing of the hill slope model within CLM has been uncoupled to the atmosphere, running coupled experiments remains a very real and exciting opportunity for the modeling inclined CZ community going forward. So one final thing that I would like to do today is to point all of you to this new National Academies report to the National Science Foundation. The official title of the report is A Vision for NSF Earth Sciences 2020 to 2030, but the unofficial title is the so-called Earth in Time report. I had the immense privilege of being part of the writing committee for this report, and as an aside, what I'd like to do as well is just thank everybody in the Critical Zone community that provided feedback to the writing team, and in particular those of you that I spoke with directly about the new and interesting research ideas on the horizon, as well as some of the bigger picture issues that we face in our scientific community. So this report is important because it is going to guide the National Science Foundation's Earth Sciences Division, or EAR, in the next 10 years as they make investments to drive new scientific discoveries, as well as increasing diversity, equity, inclusion in the earth science enterprise. So I would encourage all of you, particularly those that are early career folks in the audience, to take a look at this report because the critical zone sciences feature prominently. And they feature prominently both in a number of the priority science questions that were developed by the writing team, but also in a lot of the discussions about infrastructure that is necessary to achieve those scientific discoveries, as well as partnerships within other divisions at NSF and with other agencies outside of NSF. Wrapping all of this up, I'd like to conclude by saying that this is a wonderful time if you are a critical zone scientist that is interested in climate change. In particular, there are a whole host of open scientific questions that center around the two-way connection between the climate and the critical zone. And along with those open scientific questions, there are a variety of new modeling tools that are open source with very open and welcoming communities that are looking for new and enthusiastic people to come in and help make some of the new scientific discoveries that will ultimately help us understand that relationship between the critical zone and the climate. So thank you all very much for your time today, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there virtually to take questions and discuss with you all. But please do reach out to me via email here up on the screen or via Twitter if you have any questions or if you just want to chat. And the last thing I will do is leave you with the references that are scattered throughout all of the talk. So thank you again, and I hope you all are having a great summer.